Hi everybody, thank you for joining us today. My name's Terry and we're going to be talking about outcomes. That's myself there, Terry Langton. Just to give you an introduction about myself, I've been working in social care for about 15 years, lots of different providers, also as a consultant with an organisation called Paradigm. And I was a person-centred planner, amongst other things. So today we're going to talk about outcomes. And usually what we do in these presentations, usually our webinars have about a 10-minute presentation and then a 30-minute demonstration of the system. It's kind of flipped today. We're going to do quite a few slides about this because it's kind of a topical discussion rather than looking at the system. So we're going to do an outcomes presentation. Then at the end, just a very quick look outcomes on the iplanit system. Okay, just to give you some background as to why we wanted to do this presentation. Well, iplanit's done hundreds of rollouts. It's an online system, and because it's online, it creates a lot more accountability. It makes providers really look at their processes. It gets their plans and their risk assessments and so on all up into one space, which really enables staff to be able to communicate better, and the person supported can see their plan, and there's transparency. And one of the core aspects of iplanit is outcomes, because setting outcomes with the people we support helps drive change, and that's an important part of iplanit. So we've trained thousands of staff. I myself, my main role within iplanit is training, and whenever we're training iplanit, we always come up against the topic of outcomes, because iplanit does create a lot more focus on outcomes. It raises questions, it prompts guidance and discussion, and people want to talk about it. If you look at this next slide, one of those reasons is, or what I've found when I've talked to lots and lots of providers across the UK and Ireland, is when we look at that provider's plan, whether it's a person-centered plan or a support plan, or whether they've got one plan or a couple of plans for that person, because all providers are different. Some break them out into like a health action plan and a support plan, and then a person-centered plan. Other providers put them all in one space and have one big plan. But broadly, you would find that in the plan there are person-centered approaches in there, and there's a support plan aspect, there are personal care aspects in there. There are the goals and outcomes, whatever you want to call them. There are who are the people that are important to them, the day-to-day tasks that need to be done, and routines. So having that creates a bit of a challenge, I think, and I've experienced it, because the goals and the outcomes are kind of threaded through the plan, which is not wrong in any way, but it makes it very difficult to create accountability around that, and for staff to refresh themselves. It kind of buries the action side sometimes, and it leaves it to only being reviewed every time the plan's being reviewed. So the goals and the actions and the outcomes aren't really in the staff's face. They're not there reminding them on a week-to-week basis about the things we're pursuing. They have to go and look at the plan and read through it and find it out and kind of dig it out. A lot of providers separate that and put it into an action plan with other things like the day-to-day stuff and the routines. But the iplanit system, what it does is it separates those outcomes from the plan. It pulls them out and has its own outcome page in the system. You've got that example of the orange box, outcome 1, 2, and 3, and pulling that out, it creates a lot more accountability and visibility, and then the staff start to see their names put up against outcomes, and there are due dates, and they'll get reminders if it's not done. So it becomes a lot more of a live, ongoing, week-to-week, day-to-day plan than outcomes and goals being kind of buried in a bigger plan and just reviewed every 6 months. So it creates urgency, transparency, and so on. So when staff see that, it's not a bad thing, and staff don't think it's a bad thing, but it makes them think more about it, and then they probably ask more about it. And this is something that comes up more and more. and it's usually by the provider, it's usually very welcomed, and the staff are keen to get it right. But it kind of puts a focus or a spotlight on it that hasn't really been there in the past in that context. So because of that, thought let's just go through it today, some of the things that we talk about on our training. So what do we mean by outcome? Well, we want to, I think it's really important that we don't get bogged down with language. Okay, so language is very important in our sector, talking about people in a respectful way, talking about people in a positive way, not focusing on the negative aspects or the things that people can't do. It's about focusing on what people can do and the opportunities, and as I say, and respect. But as with any sector, not just social care, but any sector, we all develop a kind of a shorthand or our own language, like a provider speak language. So sometimes when we're talking about outcomes, we can be thinking from a service provider perspective. So, for example, if a bunch of managers are sitting around going over key performance indicators and reports and statistics, and we're talking about outcomes, it's really much of a paper exercise at that point, isn't it? And we're talking about statistics and collating information, and the need for outcomes to exist. It becomes a bit of a counting exercise, as well as quality. That's no bad thing. You know, we need to count things, we need to have reports, and we need to have statistics. It's a very, very important and crucial aspect of being a provider. But as managers, we have to lead by example. And sometimes what can happen is that discussion and culture around the perspective that managers may have about the statistics side of it and the reporting side of it, that definition of outcomes can kind of drift into the direct support delivery aspect. So when providers say, you know, can you create 10 outcomes per person? That can be a bit of a statistical exercise, but it might also be used in context to drive change and to get people to use it. So everything has to be in context, but we don't want people making outcomes for the people they support for the sake of it or to hit a minimum target. You know, we want them to be meaningful outcomes. So we have to be careful about provider speak. So, you know, when we talk about outcomes, it's got to really mean that the thing that the person wants to achieve, and you know, the goals that that person has, or the aspirations that person has, and so on and so forth. We have to check ourselves with that, because it's definitely a sector where the shorthand and the service orientated language can affect the perspectives direct support staff have. So I think it's really important to kind of recognize we need to lead by example on that front. So I've got this pyramid here. It's quite a, you know, I haven't created this. This is a long-standing demonstration here. So it starts with the person-centered principles are the foundation of anything. Now, when I say person-centered principles, I don't mean person-centered plans. I just mean person-centered principles, putting the person at the focus of the support has to be the foundation of anything. So I'm going to use that term a lot in these slides, and I don't want you to think I'm talking about person-centered plans. In fact, one of the reasons iplanit exists originally when we started it in 2010 was because people were putting so much time and effort and energy into making these fantastic person-centered plans, and then they would sit on a shelf and nobody would look at them. So the planning and the person supported felt very understood, but they didn't really see the benefit of the action side of it, you know, putting the plan into action. So they didn't really see that. So I'm not talking about person-centered plans today. I'm just talking about person-centered principles and values, putting the person at the center of the decision making and the outcomes and the planning. So values approach has to start with the person, and then it goes on to the provider needs. So there's person-centered principles. From that, we make a plan with the person about what we're going to do with the support, what they're going to do. From that, we set outcomes, the goals. And then the last thing that happens there is the KPIs. So everything is built on the next step. So outcomes feed into the key performance indicators. But if we took out the planning there, the outcomes would have little direction. If we took out the person-centered principles, then the planning would be around service delivery rather than person-centered. person-centered principles and approaches, the person would be the last thing considered. So if the person is the main thing considered, you can build on that. So in terms of the word outcome, outcome is the result. I mean, we're not getting into the Webster's dictionary definition, but outcomes are the result of action by the person or the staff, but usually both. And the word goal is looking forward. The word outcome is both something to achieve or an achievement. So it can kind of be future, past, or tense. I found myself being drawn into semantics with staff about the word outcome. I don't care. I don't think anyone should care. We all know what it should mean is that it drives change. It's things that the person wants to achieve. It could be a goal. If a goal is an easier word to understand, then that's what you should use. The iplanit system can be configured, nearly all of it can be configured to reflect the language of a provider. So we've just settled on the word outcome, and there's a lot of government kind of work, outcome-based support, outcome-based funding and so on. So we've gone with the word outcome, but what we mean is driving change in somebody's life. But that then does create, there's a tension there between, and this is really for managers, not for direct support staff to even get involved in, but there are push-pull factors. So there is, if we start on the left, we've just talked about this pyramid. We start with person-centered approaches and values. That turns into the box in the middle, plans and outcomes, reflecting the person's needs and aspirations. And then the box on the right, the provider needs to report the effect of that planning, the value for money, again, and the outcomes against targets, the key performance indicators. So that's really a flow, isn't it? We start with person-centered values, and we end up with the provider being able to evidence that through the plans and outcomes, this is how support is being delivered in a safe and effective way. So those first two boxes drop down into kind of the support delivery aspect. Person-supported needs outcomes in the green box there to improve life, give the team focus, and know what successful learning looks like. The red box, the provider needs evidence this is care and to a high standard. And these two things don't need to be mutually exclusive. And I think this is one of the reasons iplanit sits very well. iplanit sits really well in this space about pulling these things together. Now, if we were having key performance indicators have to drive some outcomes, which can happen, that's okay. If we have that person-centered values filter, so we go back to that pyramid, if we have the person-centered values foundation or pyramid that everything has to go through or filter through, then it's okay if a KPI drives outcomes. Like, for example, I've ran services where I've been told we have to have housing outcomes if we're going to get this funding. So it's reasonable to expect I have to write some housing outcomes, but that doesn't need to become a paper exercise, because maybe we should have been writing housing outcomes anyway with this person I was supporting. But if we put that through the filter, the person-centered values filter, then that's okay. And therefore, this, rather than this being a straight line, it can kind of turn into a loop where keep the demands of the provider and the needs of the person supported don't have to be at odds with each other, as long as we have that core foundation of person-centered values. And I think that's the thing that managers need to be thinking about to make sure that outcomes are being written well, and that they reflect what is important to the person and so on, but also meets the needs of the provider to be able to continue delivering that support. Which comes to that bottom line there, which means a well-written, meaningful outcome just can pull all of this together and make everybody's life a lot easier, give much more focused support, and create the evidence set that a provider needs. So how do we do that? How do we kind of make that very simple for staff to kind of just execute and get on with? Well, I think it's really important to make things as simple as possible, and that's not in a patronizing sense to direct support staff, like they couldn't handle this or anything like that. We don't mean that, but the majority of direct support staff want to come to work and want to know what they need to do, know the direction of the support they're delivering, and know that it's being recognized, and see the person they support progress. And that's what they need. They need to know, what are we doing? What are we as a team doing to be able to support this person? And outcomes is not the whole picture of that, but it plays a very, very important part. It plays the part of driving change forward. So, and we can break those outcomes into just two very, very simple categories. And that is what is important to the person and what is important for the person. So things that are important to the person, you've probably seen this before, things that are their aspirations, things that can increase their life experience, and things that will develop their skills and independence. And those are things that are usually very easy to identify as outcomes. We're usually very, very good at identifying them things and turning them into outcomes. The important for what the person needs, how to help them stay relatively safe, managing risk, personal care, their well-being, like diet and medication and equipment that they might use. As support providers, we're very, very good at delivering that. But sometimes, and those are the provider responsibilities, so there's that kind of tension, not necessarily a tension, but there's a dichotomy there between important to and important for. Important to is all about the person and that person-centered approach, putting them at the center, and then important for is kind of the provider responsibilities about keeping that person or helping maintain that person's safety and health. What I found is we can you need to identify outcomes in both categories, otherwise your outcomes and the opportunity to evidence those outcomes will be one-sided, or you could miss a lot of opportunities. So it's really, whenever I talk to staff, we just kind of talk about these two topics. Is it important to the person or important for the person? And that's our starting point. And generally speaking, they fall into these two categories. But again, it's not mutually exclusive. It could be, like an example could be, it's important for Jack to have his medication at 3, and that's okay. So that's great. He has his medication at 3. So that's important for him to do that to stay healthy. But it's actually important to him that this is done in private, no one sees, and he has a glass of milk instead of a glass of water with his meds. And that's the difference between the two. So that helps, having that lens, the important to and the important for lens, can really help us bring focus to what we're doing, because sometimes talking about these things can get so broad that it's actually difficult to articulate and staff don't know what to do. So it also lends itself to missed opportunities, because definitely on the important for side of it, so complex, and particularly in complex support services, or in support services where a person might not be able to communicate traditionally with verbally, or that there's a lot of health needs in that support delivery. We can miss a lot of opportunities of identifying outcomes in the important for. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. So complex support services can often not create the outcomes that need to be done. That we could. They don't recognise the outcomes that exist within that service, and I'll talk about that in a second. The important too, the more support needs a person has, sometimes the more difficult it is to identify what is important to the person, which kind of relies on good planning. So generally, if there's a lot of care involved, the support tends to, or the support tends to be, or the outcomes are very difficult to identify aspirations. So that really comes down to good planning. We'll look at that now for a second. So what I see regularly when I'm training people is that sometimes absolutely brilliant support is being delivered, but they don't recognize that some of the things they're doing could be identified as outcomes. So if staff regularly don't recognize their own great person-centered practices, they therefore don't include what can appear as simple things as outcomes, and therefore there's no evidence of this support. And there's a risk that if the staff move on, then those things that they're doing that aren't written as outcomes could be missed. For example, areas around personal care, or areas around medication delivery, for example, or equipment, or a person's routine. Some staff can really feel that this is just what we do here, and they don't realize that actually what they're doing is a high level of individual approach in terms of the service. They've really individualized the support, and if they're not creating outcomes around that, firstly, there's a risk that that focus they have drifts, and there's definitely the missed opportunity for the provider to be able to record and evidence that and include that when they're being inspected externally or internally. So if we don't write down the good things we're doing, we can never show people what good services we deliver, and that's like a missing link in terms of outcomes. And that really is to do with staff awareness and staff education about what an outcome is. So if we just look at some examples here, this is the same support. So this is an example from the same support being delivered. And on the left is what the outcomes would have been. And then you raise the awareness about the importance of the outcomes and how you need to look at your own service that you're delivering in a new light. And on the right is the improved or revised outcome. So ensure Darren has a bath every night. That was an outcome that was written in. And that's kind of like, well, okay, if we apply the principles, the SMART principles, is it achievable? Yes, it's been achieved. And you kind of say, well, that's the outcome is he had a bath. We don't know how that bath went. We don't know, whether it was important to him or for him. We don't really know anything. We just know Darren has a bath. And if we were being inspected, if you were the outside looking in, does that column on the left reflect the support that's being given? It doesn't really give us much, does it? So on the right is an example of how you could improve that. I want to have a bath every night and follow my routine that I've worked out with my team, and that routine would be in the plan. We don't need to put the routine into the outcome. What we're saying is I've made a routine. I want that to be followed every night. That's indicating a person-centered delivery of personal care. Now, whether this is important to them or it's important for them to get a bath, but it might be important to them to get a bath every night, and that's an important part of their support. We have these kind of filters and tools to say, well, look, the one on the left is not doing the support team any justice with the amount of work they've put in to get that routine done. And it's not, if family were to look at that, they would think, okay, he gets a bath every night. I want the staff to know that they have to follow the routine. So adding this kind of richness to it really is important. So we could have on the left again, Darren to be supposed to go to bed at 11 p.m. each night. I see this outcome written a lot. And we're kind of talking about day-to-day stuff here rather than the big aspirational things like going on holiday or moving house. I think those things are quite easy to deal with as outcomes. The missed opportunities is in the smaller day-to-day stuff where the staff have to do a lot of work. Like, for example, going on holiday could be a massive achievement for one person, but it could equally, another person making their own cup of tea, that could require the same amount of work to be able to do that, and it's equally important to them. And that's where that person-centered filter that we need, where everything is individualized and everything is contextual to the person, is really, really important. So Darren to be supposed to go to bed at 11 p.m. each night, not a great outcome. He just goes to bed at 11 and then it's done or not done. It hasn't really shown the quality of the service. Whereas on the right, develop a nighttime routine that ensures Darren sleeps around 5 hours and reflects his preferences throughout. Again, you're seeing, if you're on the outside looking in, this means something, and it also means something to the staff as well. If I was a staff member and I had little experience with Darren and I'm just being, so he's got to go to bed at 11 p.m, and nothing there to point me towards how important his routine is, nothing there to point me towards the purpose of it, because we're trying to get him to get 5 hours sleep. Maybe he doesn't sleep well. We're looking at this in isolation, but I think you get the meaning. Whereas on the right, I think at least just looking at the outcome, which is very easily accessible, I don't have to go reading through the whole plan. You can see the outcome. It gives me more direction, more flavour for the service, something to evidence against. And that outcome can be linked to a number of key performance indicators, whereas the one on the left can probably just be linked to one or two and evidence against one or two, whereas the one on the right is about choice and control and routine and person-centered approaches and health. The one on the left is just kind of more about routine, and So if you have to think about that. The one I come across a lot is when support staff say, well, look, in this example, Darren uses a wheelchair. We support him to do that. He's always going to use a wheelchair. How do I write an outcome around that? Like if there's a long-standing health need or something like that, there's a long-standing support need. How do I write an outcome around that? And the principal would push back is to say, look, you know, he might have that long-term health need or support need, but that doesn't mean that's an absolute static part of his life. It could be, for example, Darren uses a wheelchair. They've not wrote any outcome around that. When actually, if they kind of put that person-centered filter and approach and had that as the foundation, they could say, well, let's talk to Darren and let's see if there are ways for him to be more independent in using his wheelchair. And as this is they're at the beginning of this exploration with Darren, they'll create the outcome saying, let's find 3 new ways for Darren to increase his independence in his wheelchair. That could be met very, very quickly, or it might take a lot more work. But then once that's been achieved, they could set a more specific outcome that as they've learned more, their outcomes could become more specific about him using his wheelchair and about his independence. It could become an environmental thing, like, you know, we're going to look into a budget so that his house can be adapted a bit better. Their outcomes can really drive that aspect of things. So sometimes the staff need help and prompting to really think about what they're doing, and they need managers who are outside looking in to promote that with them and to encourage them to recognize that and recognize the good work that they're doing. Or alternatively, you know, if it's kind of a stale support service, then the outcomes can really help drive, you know, reinvigorating that service for the person. But again, you now on the right, you have a richer evidence set. It gives a flavour for the support service. The staff have a little bit more understanding about what's actually important. The discussion around important 2 and important 4 is very simple, and it can help the staff understand Darren's circumstances and the goals for Darren and the goals for the service. And in terms of kind of leading on outcomes, you need to keep it simple. You know, we've talked about KPIs and the tensions and, you know, the duality between the two, the provider tension and the service delivery for the person supported, and how sometimes they can be at loggerheads but they don't need to. I certainly don't talk to support staff about that, again, not because in any kind of patronizing sense, but just because they generally don't need to know that. They just need to focus on the person. That's their role, and it's the manager's role to kind of balance the more complex aspects around that challenge of evidence sets and key performance indicator. So those writing or implementing outcomes should have the person at their focus. And if we get these outcomes written well, like just that simple example there, you can see the increase there. That was a real example. Management can benefit by outcomes being written well as this develops a rich evidence set as well as good practice. So when I'm talking to staff about the outcomes, I don't want them to get lost about it or to feel that it's complex in any way. And, you know, it's better to make mistakes or write outcomes that aren't great but heading in the right direction. You know, we don't want to put pressure on staff to become a literary genius in how to write an outcome. It's not really about that. It's about the person supported and driving change. So I kind of have these 3 principles that I talk to staff about. Keep it simple. It's a judgment call from the provider whether the direct support staff need to know about this key performance indicator tension, this evidence set that's required. If the driver is about the person, about being person-centered and having those values thread throughout the service and putting the person at the service, then those outcomes will look good anyway, and they will be good and they will be relevant to the person and hopefully driving change. And if they're doing that, another role or another manager can be the person who collects that evidence set. And I'll show you on iplanit how that works now in a couple of minutes. But somebody else can do that role. You know, you don't have to burden direct support staff. It's a judgment call. You know, it really depends on your staff. But in my opinion, I think there is. It's always about the person. I'm sure you agree. There's no such thing as a service outcome. So when we talk about important 2 and important 4, the important 4 about helping somebody stay safe and medication and so on, people sometimes call that a service outcome. And I just don't think that's just a lack of imagination. And if you're putting the person at the center of the service, then there's no such thing as a service outcome. The person is at the center of the service, then medication, risk assessment, personal care, these service outcomes that they get called sometimes, they're really just about the person and how they want their service delivered, or how they need to have their service delivered to stay safe. So I think using terms like service outcomes kind of dilutes what it is that's trying to do. It kind of bypasses the person-centered filter and goes straight into outcomes and KPIs. When if we put it through the person-centered filter, service outcomes kind of is a pointless use of language. So keeping it simple, don't have to tell them about the KPIs. The staff, direct support staff who are writing these outcomes, just need to know about putting the person at the focus. And you'd be surprised how much they need. That you have to remind them of that. So when they're writing outcomes, I just keep saying the same things to them. Is this about the person? Is that what's important to the person? Is it important for the person? How do we write this? You just keep bouncing until people get the hang of it. SMART objectives. Now, we certainly don't employ direct support staff to be able to remember business acronyms like SMART: specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely. We talk about it sometimes, and you can see people's eyes glaze over when we mention it to them. So when people write outcomes, I just simply ask people, how will you know when this has been done? Will you know when this has been achieved? What does success look like? And asking that question kind of puts the SMART principles into their head. So I use that a lot, rather than saying, let's keep it specific and measurable. It's really boring stuff. You just ask people, you wrote this outcome. Is it so vague we don't know when we've achieved it? Is it so big we need to break it down? Is it so specific it's irrelevant? It's common sense approaches, but because it's a big topic, people can get overwhelmed by it. And then the constant values question, just to help articulate things in staff's mind and in your mind when you're dealing with this, the important to and important for. The constant values question, is this an important to and important for? And if it's important for, are we exploring that right? If it's important to, have we definitely understood that this is the person's aspiration? Ask it of every outcome, gives perspective. If there are too many important fors, then maybe we need to do some more work around person-centered planning, so that if it's a complex support service, the person has complex support needs, and nearly all of their outcomes are about important for and keeping safe, which is no bad thing. The absence of the important to, their aspirations and life goals and life experiences, we can say, well, we actually need to put some work there, because their outcomes are very much about the important for. And then I won't read all of this out, but it's just a nice little slide to kind of think about things, what a good outcome includes. It's important for the person to reflect the person's strengths and so on. I mean, I like this slide, but I also think, you've got to still keep it simple for people. I wouldn't want too many people to be thinking that every outcome has to reflect the person's strengths. We can overcomplicate it. But as a managers, this is a lens we can look through. Okay, so that's chosen by the person. It's reflective and varied, a mixture of big and small. It's creative and it's meaningful. These are things I think managers should look at outcomes and push and nudge staff to rethink the outcomes to kind of fall in line with this. But what you do find is, as staff are writing the outcomes and putting them into iplanit, there is a sense of ownership and accountability, and they're comfortable with that. When outcomes are vague and broad and fluffy, staff kind of glaze over and just think, I don't know what to do. I don't know what success looks like.